Imagine this scene. The greatest king of England, once the brightest prince in Europe, now turned into a swollen corpse, so foul that it burst inside his own coffin. The stench of death spread through the chapel, making even the most battle-hardened courtiers retch. And in utter humiliation, people saw dogs licking the dark fluid seeping from the royal body. This was not rumour, not slander from an enemy. This was the truth. Henry VIII, the king who once defied the Pope, who cast 6 wives into tragedy, who built an empire from blood and fear, did not leave this world in peace. He died in excruciating agony. His body was consumed by infection, his mind shattered by madness, and even in death, his own flesh betrayed him. Tonight, we strip away layers of myth and propaganda to face the horrifying truth of Henry VIII's final days, a story of power turning into paranoia, of glory devoured by disease, and of a king whose end was so grotesque it was hidden for centuries. When Henry VIII ascended the throne in 1509, all of Europe looked on with admiration. He was tall, strong, handsome, with eyes that shone with confidence. Foreign envoys compared him to Alexander the Great, to King David in the Bible, a Renaissance prince in whom intellect, strength, and artistry flowed together in one man. Henry could compose music, write poetry, persuade with words, and command with force. At that time, the few could imagine that the man hailed as the rising star of Christendom would become one of the most infamous tyrants in English history. But his downfall did not come overnight. It began with a moment that seemed ordinary, yet changed everything. On the 24th of January 1536, at Greenwich Palace, Henry, then 44 years old, rode into the tilt yard amid the cheers of thousands who wore a golden armour, glorious upon his war horse, ready to prove he was still the strongest man in England. The lances lowered, hooves thundered, and then disaster. His horse slipped. A body of more than 130 kilos, encased in steel, crashed to the frozen ground. The sound was like thunder, and in that instant, the kingdom fell silent. Henry was unconscious. For 2 endless hours, England had no king. For 2 hours, Queen Anne Boleyn, pregnant at the time, wept in terror, knowing that if Henry died, her own fate and that of her unborn child would also vanish. And when Henry finally opened his eyes, he was no longer the same man. Modern doctors believe the fall caused brain trauma, damage to the frontal lobe, the part that governs personality, restraint, and compassion. An invisible crack in the mind turned the shining prince into a fearful shadow. Before the accident, Henry was seen as stern but fair. He remained loyal to his first wife Catherine of Aragon for 20 years, ordered executions rarely, and enjoyed intellectual debate. But after the fall, all that was gone. Suspicion replaced trust. Cruelty replaced mercy. And only 4 months later, Anne Boleyn lost her head beneath the axe. His closest advisor, Thomas Cromwell, soon followed her to the grave. From then on, England had no reasonable king. They had only a tyrant. Sinking deeper into rage, paranoia, and ruin, the accident of 1536 did more than leave invisible brain damage. It also awakened an old wound, and from it began the slow decay of Henry VIII's body. Years earlier, in another joust, he had been injured in the leg. The wound had seemed to heal. But after the fall at Greenwich, it reopened, and this time, it never closed again. Imagine an ulcer the size of a tennis ball gaping on the king's leg. It never scabbed, never stopped oozing, day after day. Basins of yellow pus and thin blood were carried away. While the stench of rot seeped through the palace, Henry's personal physician, Thomas Vicary, described them as wounds, horrible beyond imagination, foul-smelling and incurable. Courtiers had to change the dressings daily, even hourly, to keep the odour of death from choking the court. Henry tried everything to hide the rot. He ordered iron braces strapped to his leg, hoping pressure would force the wound shut. Instead, the steel blocked circulation and the infection spread further. With no other remedy, he drenched himself in perfumes, rose oil, musk, anything to mask the stench, but no fragrance could conceal a body being eaten from within. Today, doctors call this disease chronic osteomyelitis, a chronic bone infection, where bacteria from the ulcer seep into the blood, poisoning the whole body. The toxins did not only bring Henry daily agony, but also drove his mind into further confusion, irritability, and unpredictability. That wound that never healed was a death sentence hanging above him, gnawing day by day at both the body and the soul of the most powerful king of England. And it was only the beginning of a tragedy, far more terrible. The ulcers that never closed were only one part of the nightmare. Alongside them, Henry VIII's body began to swell, transforming into a massive, heavy, decaying bulk with each passing day. From a young prince who once hunted and rode tirelessly, Henry became bound in immobility. He turned to food as comfort, day after day. The royal table was piled high with roasted meats, wine, and sweet pastries, and no one dared to restrain him. Without movement, his body ballooned like an overinflated barrel. The remaining suits of armour still testify to this transformation. If in youth Henry's waist measured about 40 inches, by 1545 it had grown to 54 inches, the width of a refrigerator. The palace itself had to be remodelled, for the king's body doorways widened, floors reinforced with extra beams, special chairs crafted with removable arms so he could fit into them. Movement became torture. Each time he rose from bed, pulleys and ropes were required to hoist his bulk upright. 6 strong men were needed to turn him to change the sheets. To be dressed, he lay motionless, while 4 attendants layered garments over his massive frame. Outdoors, he was no longer a majestic king on horseback, but a figure hidden in a wheeled chair, silently rolled along under fearful eyes. But more frightening than all was the smell. The stench of decay from the king could not be concealed. Nobles carried pomanders, small spheres filled with herbs and spices, to cover their noses upon entering his chamber. Delicate ladies fainted within minutes of an audience. Ava guards, hardened by the stench of battlefields, could not endure it, many vomiting during their watch. Henry knew this truth well. He knew he was rotting while alive, and this horrifying awareness eroded the last fragments of his humanity, plunging him ever deeper into rage, despair, and madness. As his body decayed, Henry VIII's mind also crumbled. Toxins from the ulcers entered his blood, attacked his brain, and turned a once shrewd king into a man lost in hallucination and perpetual fear. Henry began conversing with the dead. On sleepless nights, he whispered arguments with his father, Henry VII, about money. He cried out to his mother, long departed. At times, he fell to his knees, sobbing, begging forgiveness from Catherine of Aragon, the first wife he had cast aside to wed Anne Boleyn. Most chilling of all were the blood-curdling hallucinations. Witnesses recorded Henry suddenly leaping up, 6 guards struggling to hold him down, while he screamed at an empty chair in the room, "You witch! How dare you mock me? I will behead you again," in those wild eyes. It seemed Henry saw the ghost of Anne Boleyn, mocking him with relentless reproach. The court, long accustomed to his violent moods, devised a secret system to survive. Ribbons of different colours were hung outside the king's bedchamber, white for calm, black for despair, red for rage. One glance told everyone how to prepare for a day where a sneeze or a misstep might cost a head. Henry slid ever deeper into madness. He signed death warrants for people long dead. He suspected everyone, even his own children. In the shadows of the Tudor court, whispers spread that England no longer had a king, only a rotting giant, insane in both body and soul. Christmas of 1546. The Tudor palace was cloaked in dread. After the splendid feasts of old, now only the groans of a king, turning into a corpse, remained. Henry's face was bloated, his skin yellow-grey, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. His tongue was so swollen he could barely speak, his whispers thick with foul breath, his legs split open, leaking green-brown fluid, the classic sign of gangrene. Each dressing change was torture, with attendants fainting beside his bed. 6 strong men were required to shift his enormous body across sheets soaked in the stench of death. Henry's organs began to fail. His urine turned dark as thick coffee. His belly swelled with fluid, leaving him gasping for air as if strangled. Pain tormented him day and night. And to forget it, he drank more wine, swallowed more food, only to hasten the cycle of destruction. In January 1547, death drew near. On the 27th, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was urgently summoned to the king's bed. Before him, the prince, who had once been the pride of England, was now only a mountain of rotting flesh. Henry convulsed so violently that the wooden bed creaked. 6 courtiers had to pin down the massive body. From his mouth poured black bile, so foul that Cranmer admitted in his diary that he vomited twice on the spot. In his final agony, Henry cried out mad words of flames, of demons crawling from under the bed, of the mocking laughter of children long dead. He wept for his mother, whispered apologies to Catherine of Aragon. Then, at 2:07 in the morning, he clutched Cranmer's hand tightly, and that hand suddenly went limp. Henry VIII was dead. But the tragedy did not end there. Only hours later, his enormous corpse began to swell, gases tearing apart the organs. The bowels blackened, the liver dissolved, his body was stuffed with salt and herbs, placed in a lead coffin. But the decay continued, and on the journey to Windsor, at Sion Abbey, the coffin burst like a thunderclap. A stream of thick black fluid seeped onto the stone floor. The next morning, witnesses saw dogs licking what remained from the body of the king once called Defender of the Faith. A death not only horrifying, but one of the greatest humiliations in the history of the English crown. The death of Henry VIII was a tragedy. No one dared admit. A king who had defied the Pope, who had declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, now ended as a rotting corpse, exploding in his coffin, his body desecrated by dogs. For the Tudor court, this was unbearable. No one wanted the image of mighty England tied to stench and decay. So the truth was buried. Official records claimed the king died with dignity, laid to rest in solemn honor. Witnesses were sworn to silence. The chronicles of history washed away every stain, leaving posterity with the image of a monarch departing in peace. But the truth could not be hidden forever. Fragments of doctors' notes, reports from foreign envoys, secret diaries, together painted a horrifying picture. Henry VIII did not simply die, he rotted alive. From a radiant prince, pride of Europe, Henry became a mad giant, his body consumed by infection to the bone, ending in unimaginable disgrace. That death did not only close the life of a king, It became a chilling reminder of the fragility of power and of the human flesh. Perhaps the most haunting part is not the bursting corpse, not the dogs licking the ooze from the coffin, but the lies written afterward. They buried the truth with him and left us only one question. Was this the punishment of fate for a tyrant? Or simply the proof that no matter how great the power, in the end we are all but perishable flesh?